Ciao friends, welcome to another video from SQL BI. In this video, we're actually not going to talk about DAX. I know, don't take my Italian passport just yet, because we're going to talk about what DAX is actually used for a lot of the times. Power BI reports. It's important that your reports have a good design so that users can find the information they need to make decisions and take actions to get the results they want. But you don't need to be a design expert or a data visualization expert in order to start making good reports. In this video, we'll teach you a rule that anyone can use in order to start making more useful reports in Power BI. This rule is known as the 3-30-300 second rule, and it's all about how much time a user has to spend on your report in order to get what they need. To start, in 3 seconds, they need to be able to get an overview of the most important questions and areas in the report. Before, in 30 seconds, they have to be able to filter and zoom to identify important areas and periods. And in 300 seconds, they need to be able to get details on demand to get the information they need to actually make those decisions and take those actions. This rule is based on the visual information seeking mantra from Ben Schneiderman, and it's something taught to me by my friend and mentor, Joris Klerks. To better explain and understand this, let's take a look at an example in some Power BI reports. To repeat, the 3-30-300 rule is all about how long a user has to spend on your report in order to get what they need. In 3 seconds or less, they should be able to get an overview of important questions and areas. Then in 30 seconds, they should be able to filter and zoom to periods and categories where they should focus. And in 300 seconds, get details on demand in order to make decisions and take actions based on this information. Now, in order to understand this more concretely, we're going to look at some examples of month-to-date sales reports and evaluate whether these reports are effective or not and whether they're following this rule, yes or no. Specifically, what we're going to do is we're going to try to answer some very basic questions. Questions like, what are the month-to-date sales? Are we on target? Yes or no? Ideally, we should be able to answer these questions in 3 seconds or less. When a user comes to the report, this is the most basic information that should just jump out at them so that they can see it and understand it at a glance. If a user has to go searching through the graphs or tables, the numbers, in order to find these very basic answers, then chances are they're not going to come back to that report for more sophisticated questions or anything at all. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of these examples and we're going to try to answer these questions ourselves. What are the month-to-date sales? And are we on target? Yes or no? Let's look at the first example and we'll see. Remember, what we're trying to do is answer basic questions. What are our sales month-to-date and are we on target? Yes or no? When we look at this first report, the first thing that really jumps out at me is this is just a wall of numbers. I don't really see any particular number that jumps out, and if I'm trying to answer this basic question, what are our month-to-date sales, I'm going to have to really look for the column that I need, go all the way down to the bottom, and this tiny number here has my answer, that our month-to-date sales are 1.06 billion, and we're off target if we compare versus our AOP. Now, obviously this isn't very effective. If we wanted to use this report, we're going to end up playing Where's Waldo for numbers in order to try to answer more specific questions. Reports like this are often used as data dumps where people just go up here and then select Export to Excel, because there they can at least use Control F to find what they're looking for. This is obviously not very effective, and it's definitely not following this 3-30-300 rule. It takes us much longer than 3 seconds to answer these basic questions. Now, your initial reaction might be that, well, if we had some visualizations, then it would help. But even if we're using visualizations, even really nice visualizations that look really good, we can still suffer from this problem. We'll see this in the next example that's a much fancier report, but still suffers from a lot of issues. We're now going to look at the next example report, which is very different from this one. In the next example, we see that this report has a lot of visualizations. It's a month-to-date sales report that lets us choose the month. We have breakdowns by customer, by region. We see a trend by workday with an area chart. But It's not until we get to the top right up here in this card that we can see what our month-to-date sales are, or if we happen to notice it in the little label of the slicer. It takes us far too long to answer these basic questions, and the report is trying to present us with too much information at once. It's not very focused, and while it looks very elegant and professional, we still have a hard time answering these questions. This is something that's important to keep in mind. There's a difference between a report that looks nice and a report that's useful. It is important to make sure that reports do look nice, but the number one priority is that they can answer the questions that users have and that it's useful for them to be able to actually do what they need to do. This report is a good example of a report that has a lot of nice, elegant formatting, but it still takes us too long in order to answer basic questions, so it's not likely that it's going to be used in order to answer more sophisticated questions. However, we're going to take a look at another report that's a lot simpler, but also more effective. When we look at the next example, immediately in the top left, we're drawn to this big red number. It's drawing our attention, it's red, it's large. We can immediately see the month-to-date sales are 1.06 billion and that we're off target. The red is implicitly associated with a negative outcome. It calls our attention to that area of the report. So we're able to answer this question much quicker, much more effectively than in the other previous examples. Furthermore, if we continue along this 330-300 rule, once we can answer this really basic high-level overview, we can then see the areas that require our attention, the ones that are formatted orange. And if we wanted to, we could click on them in order to get more information, details on demand. We can then see for that particular region which customers are underperforming, do drill downs to get more details, or even go down to the product level. This is an example of the 330-300 level in action. A very simple example in order to illustrate the concept, but an effective example nonetheless. This report is simpler than the previous example, but it allows us to answer the questions much more effectively. If we take this even farther, we could go to an extremely simple version of the same report that doesn't have the same formatting, and we're still following this 330-300 rule. It's definitely not as effective as the previous example, and it looks a lot more rough. However, we are still able to answer our questions. The sales are 1.06 billion, they're off target. We can see which areas are underperforming, and we can get information about those areas by just interacting with them. Again, the 330-300 rule is all about the questions that we're trying to answer, focusing on those in the report and making sure that we can do it in the most effective and convenient way possible for our users. Let's look in a little bit more detail about how we can do this by setting it up for ourselves step by step and understanding the elements that actually make up an effective report that follows this rule. There are multiple reasons why these two reports are more effective and follow this 330-300 rule compared to the first two reports that we looked at. The first reason is that these reports focus on specific questions rather than trying to show everything all at once. For example, what are our sales? Are we on target? Where are we most off target? Which regions? Within a region, which customer? Within a customer, which products? So that we can actually then make the decision, take the action, have a sales conversation with the customer about those products. The user journey, the experience here, it's very clear and structured and organized, and it's focused on that. There's many possible questions that we could be looking at in this kind of scenario, but it's focused on this one. If we compare it to one of the previous reports, this is completely different. We just have information that's being shown without a context. It's harder for us to interpret, and we're just being shown too much. We have information here about the sales, not only the value, but also quantity and lines. We have orders, we have on-time delivery. It's just too much. Yes, it's interesting, it's useful, and people probably want to see this information, but it doesn't mean that we have to try to show it all on one page or even all in the same report. It's important that we define the questions we're trying to answer so that we can create structured views and experiences in order to answer them. So, reason number one, focus on the specific business questions. The second reason is all about going from top left to bottom right. The top left of the report, this region, is our most valuable real estate. When we come to the page, this is going to be where we look first. However, our overview, the most important information, is over here on the right-hand side. Being able to put the most important information in the top left and the more detailed information in the bottom right is another reason why these reports are more effective. Because the first place we look is the most important questions, and then the last place we look is the more detailed and specific questions. The third reason is about color, using color to steer attention, rather than overwhelming with color or ignoring it entirely. Here, red is being used to draw our attention to this big number, and it has a meaning. It indicates that we're off target. Then the more subtle orange indicates where we're off target, specifically which customers, which regions, so that we can focus our attention there and actually interact with the report at that point. So color being used to steer our attention and having an explicit meaning. If we compare that to the previous report, color is kind of just used aesthetically. Our attention isn't being drawn anywhere. We have different colors that are used for different numbers. It's just not effective for that reason. It's a resource that is squandered. So using color to steer attention is another reason why these reports are more effective in following this rule. The fourth reason why these reports are not as effective as the last ones that we looked at are because of limiting ink and information. That we make sure that we make formatting choices that don't overwhelm people with a lot of details so that they have to think harder about what they're looking at in order to understand it and interpret it. Related to that, we also want to keep it simple, not only in terms of the formatting, but also in terms of the chart choices that we make. We want to make sure that the charts we choose are matched to the data, the users, and the specific questions that we're trying to address. Let's look, for example, at the bar charts that we're looking at here. We made a choice to show the difference between the sales and the AOP, whereas in the previous version, we show the actual sales and the AOP next to one another. However, notice that this creates a problem where it's very difficult in a lot of circumstances to be able to identify whether we've met that target or not. If what we're actually interested in is the difference between them, then maybe it's more effective that we actually show this difference between them rather than plotting the actual numbers. It's always going to be possible for us to supply those raw numbers of the sales and the target, for example, in the tooltip. But if we're most interested in that difference, then why don't we just plot the difference? We keep it simple and we make sure that beyond that it's convenient. And this is the last reason, convenience. Making sure that users spend as little time as possible on our reports to be able to answer their questions, to make decisions, to take actions, so that they can focus on what they're actually intended to be doing. Because definitely it's not the job of people to look at our reports. They have other tasks that are more relevant, more important. If we can make sure that they're spending as little time as possible on the reports we make, then we are doing a good job. Because then they're able to get their questions as quickly as possible, as efficiently as possible, and move on to the things that they actually should be doing and that they're being paid for. So to summarize, there's a number of reasons why these charts and reports that we saw last, these versions, are more effective than the first versions that we saw, both this one as well as the matrix. So reason number one, that we focus on specific questions instead of trying to create a report that shows everything. Reason number two, we go from top left to bottom right, putting the most important information in the top left. Number three, we use color to steer attention so that we can use color as a resource and drive people's attention toward the most relevant information. But we want to limit the amount of ink and information that we're showing at once. That includes color, but also other formatting choices and the kinds of information that we're displaying. We also want to keep it simple. Choose the right charts for the data, users, and questions, but also keeping our formatting simple and not overcomplicating it if we don't need to. And of course, the last thing, make it convenient. Help users spend as little time on the report as possible so they can focus on their actual tasks instead of wasting time digging through the reports that we make. Now, these are just a high-level overview of the reasons why the second reports we looked at are more effective than the first ones. I want to reiterate that the most important reason is the focus on the business questions. But in order to understand those questions, we need to engage with the users. There's different ways that we can understand what users' questions are. And one way to do that is part of the requirement gathering process, but to really engage with people and understand what we're going to be making the report about. For example, understanding the business process that we're going to be creating the report for, that we're going to create a semantic model to represent, understanding the outcomes that people want to achieve if that process is proceeding as they expect, understanding who the users are and what they're doing in that process and how they're trying to achieve these outcomes, specifically by making decisions and actions that they want to make in order to try to achieve their specific objectives, and what problems and questions they have in order to make those decisions and take those actions, and what data they need in order to address those challenges. If we can engage with users and try to understand these different things, then it will help us to be able to make a more useful and relevant report. Now, if we wanted to make a report that follows this 3-30-300 rule, we could do this by following a series of steps. We'll go through at a very high level and explain how you can do this for yourself. First, we're going to look at a report that we're going to try to make that is similar to the reports that we've already seen. We're going to take some of the lessons that we learned and we're going to apply them to try to create a report that's structured in this 3-30-300 layout. First, we're going to create our 3-second view. We want to define and understand our really important questions. What are our sales? Are we making our target? Is the situation getting better and worse? The third one that we maybe have learned through engaging with the business. We can easily answer these by having card visuals, for example, using some icons, having a line chart that indicates whether the situation is improving or not. And we could even show at a very high level, although this is admittedly pushing it, comparison to multiple targets, so that very quickly users can see and understand that we might be behind with our AOP. However, we are managing to make our forecast and we are still able to grow compared to last year. Now, this is an example of a 3-second overview where we want to just present this really high-level overview of the situation so we can answer the most important questions. Once we've done this, and we've done this again on the left or top side of the report, we want to move on to the 30-second view. In this view, we want to really make sure we understand what categories people are interested in and how they can zoom on to specific categories that they should focus on. The objective of this 30-second area is to be able to give people the tools that they need to understand where they should focus their attention. For example, we might understand that the users are then most interested in understanding the region and customer hierarchies, and they want to understand which regions and which customers are underperforming. So we highlight this in color, we focus on the difference, and we make sure that we provide them supplemental details if they need it by, for example, being able to drill up and down this hierarchy and being able to engage with the tooltip to be able to get the relevant information that they need so that they can see which specific part of the region they need to focus on to be able to get those details. And that is the last part of the report, getting the details for the areas that they're now focused on. So let's say, for example, this region is the one that's underperforming, and we want to understand why. So we want to, in the most convenient way possible, present people a set of interactions like cross-filtering or filters in the filter pane to be able to investigate this further. If they click on this bar, they can then see in the more detailed regions of the report, tables, matrices, scatter plots to understand more detailed breakdowns of what's happening in that region. For example, which customers are behind in that region, which products, so that they can dive into these details farther. And there's various ways to do this, but the most common are with these more detailed visuals. A scatter plot is a really interesting choice here because when we select it, we might be drawn to the customers that are most behind. So we hold control and cross-filter further to be able to see for those customers what the situation is at the product level, for example. But this 300-second level area of the report, what's really critical is that we understand the decisions and actions that people are making and taking based off of the information in the report. If we don't understand that, it's really hard for us to know what details they need to make decisions and take actions. For example, an action that people might take is they might follow up with customers. In order to do that, they need to, of course, know which customers they need to follow up on and what they're going to follow up on. For example, which products or other details related to that. There are a lot of different examples of things that people might want to do based on the information they're looking at. But again, you want to make sure that you focus on specific areas and you create catered views for others. A good way to do this is by having drill through pages so that, for example, if people need to follow up with demand planning, so they want to follow up with like more supply chain, that they can create a view that's specific to that and drill through onto that view. You can even use cross-report drill through in order to do this, for example. So this is a really high-level overview of how you can create a report that goes through this 330 and 300-second layout so that you can create a more structured experience and create reports that are more useful for your users. To recap, this rule is all about making it convenient for users so they spend as little time as possible on your reports so they get what they need as quickly and efficiently as they can, starting with a 3-second overview of the situation, followed by 30 seconds to be able to filter and zoom to focus areas, and 300 seconds to be able to get details that they need to make decisions or take actions or follow up with specific investigations. If you follow this rule, anybody of any skill level can definitely improve the Power BI reports that they're going to make. Enjoy making reports.